60 laps into the Singapore Grand Prix, and Hamilton's calm voice turned into a scream. Ferrari's data screens glowed red, not from warning lights, but from failure. A 7-time world champion was driving a car on fire live in front of millions. And now, the radio messages the world was never meant to hear have leaked. The failure that silenced Ferrari did not begin in Singapore. It began months earlier in a meeting room in Maranello filled with diagrams, data, and ambition. The SF-25 was conceived as the car that would end the years of humiliation, a machine built to be efficient, elegant, and fast in a straight line. But somewhere between the vision and the wind tunnel, a quiet compromise was made. The team wanted aerodynamic purity, fewer openings, cleaner surfaces, tighter packaging. Cooling was treated not as a priority, but as an inconvenience. The brake ducts were slimmed, the bodywork sculpted, the margins squeezed. On paper, the gains were measurable. In reality, the car had been starved of air. Inside the design office, the decision looked rational. Every millimeter of drag removed meant precious speed gained on the straights. But Ferrari's engineers, driven by pride as much as by science, pushed too far. The SF-25's cooling system became a delicate maze of channels that depended on constant, high-speed airflow to function. In perfect conditions, Spa, Monza, Baku, it worked beautifully. But Formula One is never perfect. In slower, hotter races like Singapore, the ducts became suffocating chambers, trapping heat instead of dispersing it. The car was fast when it moved freely. It cooked itself the moment it was made to slow down. Lewis Hamilton had sensed it from the beginning. During pre-season testing in Bahrain, he warned of long pedal travel, a subtle but telling sign that the brake system was breathing more heat than it could handle. He repeated it again in Imola, and then again in Hungary. The car doesn't release the heat, he told his engineer. It holds it. Ferrari, unwilling to believe that their grand design could harbor such a flaw, dismissed it as driver adaptation. They trusted the data over the driver, a mistake as old as the sport itself. By the time the championship reached Singapore, the flaw had matured into a full-scale threat. The combination of humidity, street circuit rhythm, and relentless braking pushed the SF-25 beyond its threshold. The heat wasn't just inside the brakes, it was radiating into the suspension, the tires, even the cockpit. When Hamilton complained about hot air in his helmet, the team believed it was psychological. But the data would later show that the airflow through the side pods had slowed by nearly 30% under braking, a deadly imbalance no driver could compensate for. The car wasn't overheating by accident. It was overheating by design. In the garage, the engineers could see the danger developing lap by lap. The telemetry didn't lie. Disk temperatures creeping above 1,000 degrees, fluid pressure fading. They discussed options. Retiring the car was one. But with both Ferraris in the points and the world watching, withdrawal felt like weakness. "We manage," said one senior voice. And so they managed by sending Hamilton back into battle with a car already at the edge of collapse. When the brakes failed, it wasn't a surprise. It was inevitability made visible. The irony was cruel. Ferrari's engineers had built a car that was too refined for reality. The SF-25 was a sculpted masterpiece, but a fragile one. A Formula One car that demanded perfection from an imperfect world. And in that fragility lay the truth Hamilton had been trying to make them see. Speed means nothing if it cannot be sustained. Singapore didn't just expose a technical failure. It exposed a philosophy that had lost touch with the demands of racing. The day after Singapore, Maranello didn't sound like Maranello. The usual rhythm, the hum of testing rigs, the chatter of mechanics, the espresso clatter in the factory cafeteria, was gone. In its place, a kind of hushed ritual had taken over. Every engineer in the building knew what awaited them, the post-race debrief that would define their season. The SF-25, the car that had once been hailed as Ferrari's rebirth, was now the subject of an inquest. At the center of the room, a projection screen displayed the telemetry trace from Hamilton's car. A red line representing brake temperature climbed, hesitated, then shot upward like a flare before flattening out completely. That flat line meant death, total thermal collapse. The carbon disk had reached over 1,080 degrees Celsius, the material delaminating under stress. The data didn't just tell a story of failure, it exposed intent. The car had been designed too tightly, too cleanly, too beautifully. Every channel, every duct, every vent had been optimized for airflow efficiency, but efficiency had strangled survival. Fred Vasseur sat in silence at the head of the room. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Around him, the department heads took turns explaining the unexplainable. The aerodynamicists defended their design. Our simulations showed safe ranges. The mechanics insisted on procedural precision, no assembly error. The brake technicians presented their findings, component integrity confirmed. The truth hovered, unspoken, between them all. The car had done exactly what it was designed to do, and that was the problem. Then came the line that changed the tone. One senior engineer, tired, pale, still wearing his race pass around his neck, said quietly, we didn't listen to him. The room froze. Everyone knew who he meant. Hamilton had been warning them for months. The pedal's long, he'd said. It's like it's breathing. They had laughed at the phrasing, assuming it was a driver's exaggeration. But Hamilton had felt what their sensors couldn't register. The heat building, the air stagnating, the system choking. His instincts had been mechanical, not metaphorical. And now the data proved it. The engineers began replaying the race in slow motion, frame by frame. At turn 14, where Hamilton first shouted, "No brakes, mate," they zoomed in. The front left wheel glowed almost white, the sparks beneath the chassis turning to embers. The telemetry on screen showed a 3-second delay between pedal input and deceleration, an eternity at 250 kilometers per hour. He should have crashed, muttered one mechanic under his breath. But he hadn't. Through a combination of instinct, experience, and sheer reflex, Hamilton had used the gearbox and throttle to decelerate a car that no longer obeyed the laws of braking. He had kept it alive when the systems had already given up. By midnight, the report was clear. Ferrari had been living with a flaw since the first race of the season. The SF-25's underfloor geometry, designed for maximum aerodynamic load, disrupted airflow to the brake ducts at low speed. In high-speed corners, the car cooled normally. In tight, urban circuits like Singapore, airflow separation caused pockets of hot air that never escaped. The result was a gradual buildup of heat, a slow, invisible suffocation. The team had been so obsessed with numbers on a computer screen that they had forgotten the most basic law of racing. A car must first survive before it can win. Vasseur closed the meeting with one sentence: "We've built a car that works everywhere except reality." No one spoke. The engineers dispersed quietly, some heading back to their offices, others to the workshop where Hamilton's damaged car sat under the harsh fluorescent light. They gathered around it like mourners. The front left brake assembly was charred, brittle to the touch. One mechanic brushed a finger against it and watched it crumble into gray dust. "It's beautiful," he said softly, and it killed itself. The next morning, Ferrari's simulation division began the process of verification. Using computational models, they recreated the Singapore race in virtual space. The results were identical. After 20 laps, brake temperature exceeded safe limits. After 40, pressure collapse. After 55, total failure. The data confirmed that no amount of lift and coast could have saved the car. The SF-25 was fundamentally flawed. But for Ferrari, admitting that publicly would mean admitting something even worse, that the culture of silence and pride inside Maranello had blinded them to their own mistakes. Hamilton's reaction to the investigation was subdued but telling. He didn't seek vindication, he sought understanding. In the debrief that followed, he listened to every technical explanation, every justification. Then, when the room fell quiet, he said simply, "You can't fix what you don't feel. This car doesn't feel. It calculates." The engineers nodded, some reluctantly, some with quiet respect. It was a reminder that Formula One, at its core, is still a human sport. Data can measure performance, but only intuition can sense disaster before it happens. That evening, Vasseur drafted an internal memo titled _Operazione Respiro _Operation Breath. It outlined the emergency redesign of the SF-25's cooling system, enlarged brake ducts, revised underfloor channels, modified airflow veins. It was an attempt to make the car breathe again, both literally and symbolically. But within Ferrari, many knew that this was more than an engineering project. It was an exorcism, an attempt to purge the ghosts of perfectionism that had haunted the Scuderia for a decade. In Maranello, failure never stays in the machines. It seeps into the walls, the faces, the conversations that people no longer want to have. After Singapore, the corridors of Ferrari's Gestione Sportiva became colder, quieter. The hum of confidence that usually filled the air, the sound of engineers debating ideas, mechanics laughing, espresso cups clinking, had vanished. What replaced it was something heavier, invisible, but unmistakable: shame. The silence of a team that had once believed it was untouchable. Lewis Hamilton arrived 2 days later, unannounced. There was no press, no entourage, just him, calm, focused, wearing the same expression that had unsettled his rivals for years. He walked through the factory as though he'd been there for a lifetime, greeting mechanics by name, nodding at the engineers, listening more than he spoke. People expected confrontation. What they found instead was composure. "I'm not here to blame anyone," he said softly. "I'm here to make sure it doesn't happen again." But beneath that calmness, there was something unmistakable, the quiet authority of a man who knew the difference between a mistake and a system that no longer listens. Inside the design office, the mood was brittle. Engineers who once spoke with pride about the most beautiful car on the grid now avoided eye contact when the SF-25 was mentioned. Some blamed the aerodynamicists, others the strategy group. But the truth, as everyone knew, was deeper. Ferrari had built a culture where disagreement was treated as disloyalty. Hamilton's arrival, with his clinical honesty and demand for accountability, had exposed that weakness. "He asks questions we don't want to answer," one team member admitted. "He doesn't shout, but he makes you look at yourself." Fred Vasseur faced the hardest task of his career. He had been brought in to modernize Ferrari, to replace chaos with clarity, but the system he inherited was older than any single person in it, a structure built on hierarchy and history. Now, after Singapore, that structure was cracking. Meetings became tense. Every conversation seemed to carry an unspoken question. Underscore, what does Lewis think? Underscore for Vasseur, this was both a blessing and a curse. Hamilton's presence forced discipline, but it also made every failure impossible to hide. The man they had hired to save Ferrari had become its mirror, and the reflection was uncomfortable. Hamilton, for his part, showed no anger. What he showed was something more unsettling: detachment. He completed his simulator sessions, attended every briefing, but his tone had changed. There was less optimism in his words, more restraint in his praise. He didn't demand improvement, he expected it. The younger engineers admired him, seeing in his precision a kind of order that Ferrari had long lacked. The veterans, though, felt the pressure of his scrutiny. "He's too clinical," one senior mechanic said quietly. "He makes us feel like amateurs." Yet even in that discomfort there was respect. They knew he wasn't wrong. In private moments, the emotional cost of the failure began to show. Mechanics who had spent decades at Ferrari spoke of burnout. Engineers, once proud of their creativity, confessed they no longer trusted their own instincts. The SF-25 had broken more than a record. It had broken morale. "We built something that betrayed us," said a brake technician, staring at the scorched carbon disc taken from Hamilton's car. "And he still brought it home. He did what we couldn't." Those words spread quietly through the garage, not as gossip, but as truth. Hamilton himself carried the weight differently. To the outside world, he remained professional, even polite. But behind closed doors, he was relentless. In a private debrief with Vasseur, he spoke plainly. "I left Mercedes to build something lasting," he said. "But I can't build it if the people around me are afraid to be wrong." Vasseur nodded, knowing there was no defense. He had seen the same fear himself, the hesitation before every decision, the obsession with optics over outcomes. Ferrari's crisis was no longer mechanical. It was psychological. The engineers began to change slowly. Meetings became smaller, more open. Hierarchies softened. Hamilton started sitting with the aerodynamic team, asking questions, suggesting solutions. His approach was methodical, no blame, only analysis. "Let's fix the airflow," he'd say, "not the people." His quiet persistence began to have an effect. The atmosphere lifted slightly. Ideas started to flow again. But even then, the scars of Singapore lingered. Every discussion carried the shadow of that radio. Underscore, no brakes, mate, they're gone. Underscore, those words echoed through every department like a ghost neither time nor apology could banish. Outside, the media storm refused to fade. British headlines framed it as a reckoning. Underscore, Hamilton breaks Ferrari silence. Underscore, the truth behind the meltdown. Underscore. In Italy, the tone was more brutal. Underscore, il disastro rosso. Underscore, the red disaster. Journalists spoke of leaks, of internal power struggles, of Hamilton's patience running thin. Within Maranello's walls, those headlines burned. The team had always prided itself on unity, but now even that narrative was fractured. Some saw Hamilton as a reformer. Others saw him as an outsider forcing change the old guard wasn't ready for. One evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, Vasseur stood in the empty garage staring at Hamilton's SF-25. The fluorescent lights reflected off its scarlet bodywork, flawless, seductive, deceitful. He remembered what one of the aerodynamicists had said the night after Singapore: "We built art that burns." It was true. The car was a sculpture that had forgotten its purpose. And in that moment, Vasseur understood something that no technical report could explain. Ferrari's flaw wasn't in its numbers. It was in its soul.